I think we can start one.
Okay, just a second. Yeah. So is it okay if we start, Joachim?
Yes.
So I make just a quick announcement for your talk. So thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to a new session of our category seminar at UNAM. Our speaker today is Joachim Kock from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, who was nice enough to accept our invitation and who will be speaking to us about whole grain Petrinets and their processes. The title of this talk is Whole Grain Petrinets and Processes. We will be reading questions from the chat during the talk. If at any point anyone wishes to be unmuted, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. There will be a questions round at the end of the talk, and we will be reading questions from our YouTube channel. Please go ahead, Joachim. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. As I told, I was supposed to go to Mexico this summer, but as you can guess, the conference was cancelled. So now I'm only here online. So that's not quite as nice, but still nice. And I hope the conference will eventually take place, but that remains to be seen. So I switched to my Blackboard camera. And if it's too small for you to read, you just tell me, then I will write bigger. So I understand that you already had 3 or 4 maybe talks on Petrinets. So I think you're all experts on Petrinets. So I don't want to talk about Petrinets all the time. So I think I would rather step back a little bit and talk about what led up to this. So when you have Petrinets, then you can have processes. So, well, I will explain all this, but not now. I just want to give you the main idea. So if P is a Petrinet, then processes are graphs mapping to P. So that's like geometric semantics. And you also have algebraic semantics. Where the main point is that you look at 3 symmetric monoidal categories on P. And then you would think that the fact that graphs are string calculus for symmetric monoidal categories, you would think that there should be a very close relationship between these two. But that's not the case. There's a mismatch. There's a mismatch between these two, and it has to do with symmetries. And this has been studied for 40 years. And people start to make adjustments to both sides to make it match up, and it got worse and worse. And in the end, what you ended up with was a little bit far from the simple idea. But since, well, what I have been doing for now many years is each time there's a problem with symmetries, you should fix it by upgrade from sets to groupoids. That's like the idea introduced by Grothendieck in algebraic geometry. And it's still a very good idea. So I believe myself that I fixed the problem, but I mean, it remains to see what the experts say about it. I'm not an expert in Petrinets. I only became interested because I saw a problem with symmetries that I thought I should look at. But instead of going directly to this, I would like to step back and tell you about what I did before coming to this problem and why I, well, yes, okay, so let's step back. Yeah, so let's step back and talk about operands and graphs and other things. So let me erase everything. So I will talk about operands and trees and graphs and things like that. And then only in the second half will I eventually come to Petrinets. The goal is to make it sort of obvious what I wanted to do. So let's start with operands. So operands have many in, one out operations. And for that reason, you picture them like this. So this is 4 in, 1 out. So formally an operand is a sequence of sets of operations. So these are the n-array operations, and they exist for all arities. So this one is a 4-array operation. And then there's a composition law that says that if you have a k-array operation at the bottom, then you have a bunch of k operations of other arities. From this, you can get a single n-array operation where n is the sum of all these nks. So the picture is this. Let's take a ternary operation at the bottom, and then let me write the dots. So here's a 4-array and null-array and the 1 unary operation that we want to stick into this one. So first you make a picture where you just put them on top here. And then the operation allows you to contract it to a single operation. And this will be a 5-array operation because it has to be the sum of the old arities. Then you can do colored operands. And that's interesting because it includes all categories. So that just means that you should put colors on all inputs and outputs. So now you can think of it as a multi-arrow in a category. So instead of taking just one domain and one codomain, in this case it has 4 domains and 1 codomain. So categories are the special case of colored operands where all operations are in arity 1. So all of these are empty except n equal to 1. If you do that, then you get exactly a category. So of course, there are axioms that I don't want to tell you. So if you do this, then of course this composition law should, so let's say a set of colors C, then you should only compose things that match, just like in a category. So that means that you should look at the fiber product, meaning that all the output colors of all these gadgets, they should match exactly the input colors here. That's what this fiber product means. And when you do that, that's the situation where you can compose. Okay. Operands have underlying collections. The collection is just a thing like this, but without the composition law. So if you have a collection, so an operand has an underlying collection. And if you just have a collection, you can generate the free operand on it. And it goes like this. free operands on a collection is the set of, well, if we call the collection R, then it's the set of R trees with n leaves for n. In other words, the new n-ary operations of the free operand on R is the set of all trees with n leaves whose nodes are decorated by the operations in R. Okay, so that's very standard. Now, it's very clear if you just draw the trees. But if you start to dig into what is actually a tree, and you say, okay, we just ask combinatorists what is the good definition of a tree, and then they will tell you things like, sorry? A question? Well, I can't hear anything, so I just continue. So if you ask a combinatorist what is a tree, they will say something like, it's a connected graph with a connected and simply connected and with a designated vertex called the root and so on. And you can use that definition, but you need to tweak it, because if you pay attention to the pictures I made, there are open-ended edges. So the trees have open-ended edges, which are of course the leaves and the root. So they look like this. So all these are different. This is a tree with no nodes and only one root edge. This is a tree with only a unary node, and this is a tree with only a nullary node. So this does not count as a leaf. This is a leaf. So a better formalism for trees is, well, let me first talk about collections. So among all collections, there are some very nice ones that are polynomial endofunctors. So a polynomial endofunctor from C to C is something of like this. So you think of, so R is the set of operations, C is the set of colors, R prime is marked operations, meaning you mark one of the input slots. So what does this diagram do? Well, here you return the root edge, the output edge of the operation. Here you just forget the mark. And here, since you have a marked input, you can return that source. So this is the shape of polynomial endofunctors. And if you want to know in which sense it is an endofunctor, you have to consider the slice category over C. And then it is the functor given by, first you pull back along S, then you do right adjoint to pull back along P, and then you do left adjoint to pull back along T. So this is like duplicating some variables. This is like summing, taking product along the fibers, and this is summing along the fibers. So altogether, this is a sum of products of variables that may be duplicated. So altogether, it's a sum of monomials, so it's a polynomial. So there's a whole, well, you can do really a lot about with polynomial functors. And let me put just my own favorite reference is a paper I wrote with Nicola Gambino, but we did not invent it. We just wrote a paper about it that I take the liberty of recommending here. Okay, so this is a special kind of collection because here we see the operations, and here we see the colors of the output, and here we see the colors of the input. It's not all collections that arise like this, but I'll come back to that question. So now, what is a tree? A tree is, the idea is that it has exactly the same shape. So here, A is the set of nodes, set of edges. A is from the Latin languages aristas or arete, but it could also be arcs, maybe it's arcs. N is the set of nodes, and M is set of marked nodes. So to each node, you can say what is the outgoing edge. You can forget the mark of a node, and you can return the incoming edge corresponding to that mark. And now there are axioms. So you can now characterize, so this is just a polynomial endofunctor. Now I want to characterize which polynomial endofunctors are called trees. So first of all, T should be mono. It should be injective. That says that an edge is outgoing of at most one node. So that makes sense for a tree.
Yeah.
Second, S should also be mono with singleton complement. So this says that every edge is incoming to at most one node, and the only one that is not incoming to a node is the root edge. That would be this one. All the other edges are incoming to some node. And then the third axiom says that, well, using axiom 2, we can write A as either it's in the image of S, or it's the singleton complement, which is the root denoted by 1. So we have this canonical bijection. And now you can define the walk to the root function. So the walk to the root function, well, maybe it's a row. If you take an edge, so X is an edge. So what is, well, it does nothing if it's already the root. Otherwise, if it's not the root, then it's actually here by this bijection. And then you just apply P and then T. So P means that you forget the mark. So that means you go down from the edge to the following node. And then you take the outgoing edge of that one. So it always means walk towards the root. So this is T of P of X. And this makes sense if X is not the root, because then it's actually up here. And now I can formulate the last axiom. It says that for all edge, there exists an integer such that if you take k steps, then you get to the root. So that's well-foundedness, and also, well, it doesn't quite give you finiteness. So maybe I should put finite, all the sets should be finite. So, okay, so axiom 0, the finite sets. Okay, so with these axioms, a polynomial endofunctor, well, a tree is a special case of a polynomial endofunctor. And now it's very easy to say what is the, I mean, this formalism for trees is in a paper of mine called polynomial functors and trees. The nice thing about this is that now it's very easy to say what a P-tree is. So remember, P-trees appeared in the definition of the free monad, sorry, on the free operand on an endofunctor. So if this is, well, sorry, I should call it R tree. That was my endofunctor R. So I write R down here, R prime R. Now a P-tree is just a tree mapping to here in the following way. It should do all this, and the middle one should be a pullback. So that means that the edges of the tree are colored by the colors of the endofunctor. The nodes of the tree are decorated by the operations in such a way that the fiber here is in bijection with the fiber here. That's what the pullback condition says. So it just means that an n-ary node of a tree must be decorated by an n-ary operation. And furthermore, this already gives you a bijection between the input edges of a node and the input slots of the decorating operation. Okay. And then the last is one more compatibility. So the fact that you have trees and collections, well, in particular, sorry, you have polynomial endofunctors at the same footing as trees, make it very easy to say what a P-tree is. And now you can say, what is the free operand R bar? Well, it's again a polynomial. Now it's a polynomial monad. It has the same colors. And now the new operations are the R trees. So this is the set of, well, you should say, set of isoclasses of R trees in this sense. And here you should put R trees with a marked leaf. Okay, this is what I wanted to say about operands. The upshot for the purpose of this talk is that it's very nice to look at trees in this viewpoint. Because it's an operational viewpoint on trees. I mean, if you take the combinatorists definition that just takes graphs and puts simply connected and so on, you're not really modeling what you want. What we really want to model is something that has to do with the operations and its inputs and outputs. And this is precisely what this definition does. The fact that some of the edges are open-ended is implied. It's not something you put into the definition. It just comes out. So you can see the open-ended edges are those that are either not in the image of T or not in the image of S. And you can also think of this as, well, a tree should be many in, one out. So you have nodes. Every node has an output, and then it has many inputs. So this is a multivalued function, and multivalued functions are precisely given by spans where the forward leg is a monomorphism. So just thinking about what a tree is naturally leads to this definition of, or this formalism of trees. Okay, enough for operands. Now we step to graphs.
I was just wondering, Joachim, does this point of view extend to higher dimensional operands?
Depends on what you mean by higher dimensional. I mean, if you go to higher categories in the old language, like n categories, I don't know how it works, but it does extend to infinity categories in the sense of Joyal and Lurie. So there's a paper by me with Rune Haugseng and David Gebner, where we do this whole theory for infinity operands. So, I mean, the fact that it's so formal makes it easy to generalize to the infinity world. But I don't know about two categories. That's a different story. And globular operands and things like that, I don't know about. So that's something interesting to think about. What would be the globular analog? But here I'm going to step in a different direction, namely from trees to graphs. And now we begin to approach Petrinets. So graphs. And by graphs, I mean directed graphs. So there are things that look like this. Let's see. And now we read them from bottom to top, just because that's how Joachim and Street did in their paper, Geometry of Tensor Calculus. So this is an example of 3 inputs and 2 outputs. So the algebraic structures corresponding to graphs are props and properats. So there are many in, many out algebraic structures. So the operations now look like this. They have 2 in and 3 out. Okay, so there are 2 versions. One is the version of prop, which is a certain kind of symmetric monoidal category. And then there's a special case of properats that is better behaved and more monadic. There's some nice features about properats. I will talk about the difference just a little bit later. So now a bicollection is, well, maybe I should continue with R. Well, now there's a picture. Well, okay, so that's just a picture. So it's a sequence of operations indexed by natural numbers with m in and n out. And this is just a picture of such a thing. So a prop or a properat has underlying bicollections. And what you can do with props and properats is that if you have things like this and things like this, then you can stick them together by plugging these 2 in here. And altogether you get 4 out, 2 in. So you can contract any directed graph to a single operation. Okay. And the difference between props and properats is that in props you are allowed to do crazier things like this one. This is a graph, so you're allowed to contract it to a single operation, even if this is not connected. For properats, you're only allowed to contract connected graphs. Props and properats have underlying bicollections. The free prop or properat on a bicollection. So that goes like this. Let me take properat. No, let me take prop, because that's what we're going to use. So a prop has an underlying bicollection, and this functor has a lift adjoint. And what it does is that it, if you start with a bicollection, that's just, well, they're just the corollas like this. So if R is the free prop on a bicollection R, then I should say what it does on a something with m in, and I should say what it m in array operations are, and it's given by the following formula. you should look at all MN graphs decorated by R. So this MN prefix means that we only look at graphs that have M inputs and N outputs. In this case, it would be 2, 4. And this comma category means that it's decorated by the collection R, meaning that all the nodes are decorated by operations in a compatible way with the colors. So they should also be colored here. Okay, so it's M, N, so M inputs, N outputs, and everything decorated by R. So what it means is that you just, where before you only had these corollas as your operations, now you promote every graph to be an operation on its own. And the monad structure or the prop structure you get out of it is simply the fact that if you have two graphs and you stick them together, you get obviously a new graph. You don't need to contract anything because the operations are themselves graphs. Okay, so let's be a little bit more specific about this. So we want a formalism that mimics what we did for polynomial endofunctors and trees. Yeah. So now bicollection is something that has, well, let me call it A. Well, it's something that's multivalued both in and out. So how do you write that as something like before? Well, it should have a set of nodes. Yeah. It still has edges, but now both of these are spans. So there's an out incidence span here, and there's an in incidence span. And since it's a multivalued map, this should be a mono. So this is the definition of directed graph. And so it's directed graph with open-ended edges. And there should be finite sets. And there are no conditions except that these should be monos. So then you can ask, what about the morphisms? And the morphism should be, let me put primes here, a morphism from one graph to another should map edges to edges, nodes to nodes, and then it should respect the incidences. And that means that these diagram commutes. And finally, it should send nodes with a given arity to nodes with the same arity. But the arity is this fiber. This is the in arity and this is the out arity. Yeah. I mean, for a fixed node, the fiber is the arity. Yeah. So that should be preserved. So that means that these two squares should be pullbacks. Okay. So that's similar to the morphisms we had for trees before. If you look geometrically what these graphs map do, they are Ital maps in the sense of geometry. So for example, you can have covers like this. So let me draw a standard example of a Ital cover. So this is a picture of a graph that you can encode in this way, and it can map to this graph here. Namely, this node can map node arity preservingly to this one. This one can also map arity preservingly to this one, and these two to here. So altogether, this is a double cover. So it's Ital, that means it's a local homeomorphism at every node. Okay. But there's also an axiomatic notion of Ital maps by Joachim and Moerdijk. And this is an example of an Ital class of maps. So the good maps we want for graphs are the Ital maps. I think I can have here the notion of elementary graph. So that's the full subcategory consisting of the node-less graphs and all corollas. So there's this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and so on. All the corollas. And it's a full subcategory of the graphs and Ital maps. So that means that this one can map into any of these edges, but there can be no maps in the other way because nodes have to go to nodes.
Yeah.
So there are no maps from the corollas to this guy. There are also no maps between corollas of different arity because it has to be arity preserving because it has to be pullbacks. But for each of these corollas, there are m factorial, n factorial self maps or automorphisms. So that's where symmetries come in and take care of themselves. Now, this category graphs, you can check that it has certain classes of pushouts. Oh, why should I write that? It has pushouts over the trivial graph, and they're calculated pointwise. And it's easy to see that every graph like this one is the iterated push out of its elementary subtrees. So it just means that you should cut all the internal edges. And that will give you a presentation, a canonical cover of this graph by elementary subgraphs. So in the end, what you see is that, so there's a Grothendieck topology on the elementary graphs. Sorry, there's a Grothendieck topology on the graphs and Ital maps, the Ital topology. And since every graph is canonically the colimit of its elementary graphs, if you look at pre-sheaves on elementary graphs, that's the same thing as sheaves on graphs.
Okay.
And that's sheaves for the Ital topology. So the collections, a bi-collection is actually precisely a pre-sheaf on elementary graphs, because then the value on this guy says what is the set of colors, and the values on all these says what are the operations of given arities, and the map induced by the inclusions of all these tells you precisely how to recover the color from an operation. So a bi-collection is the same thing as a pre-sheaf on elementary graphs. So this is actually pre-sheaves on elementary graphs. And the fact that every pre-sheaf on elementary graphs is a sheaf on graphs means that you can actually evaluate a graph on a whole, sorry, you can evaluate a bi-collection on a whole graph. Mm-hmm. That's basically what happens here.
Yeah.
Joachim,
yes.
Joachim, you haven't drawn any directed cycles in any of your graphs.
No, I should have.
Exclude them. Do you include them or not?
I should say
okay.
acyclic.
Okay.
Exactly.
If you start to allow cycles, you don't get props and properites, you get wheeled props and wheeled properites, and it's a mess. But people study those. Okay.
Your would probably make some cycles.
Sorry?
Your push-outs would probably make some cycles.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact. Okay, I should have certain push-outs. So you're right, I cannot allow all push-outs over these, but enough to make this true. Thank you. It's true. You should be careful how you take these push-outs. You should only allow, I mean, to preserve this injectivity, for example, you need to make sure that when you take the push-out over an edge, that edge should be outgoing of one graph and incoming of another graph. There's some things to fiddle with, but it's enough to make this true. And I don't want to go deeper into that. Now I want to move to Petrinets. So the upshot of everything so far is that you should present your combinatorial structures in a way tailor-made for the purpose. In this case, we want trees and graphs to represent operations. So the good combinatorial presentation of it should reflect that. You should not just do what your combinatorics friends tell you. So now we come to Petrinets. And the reason I spoke so long about operats and properats and graphs and trees is that now it will look quite easy what a Petrinet is. So classically, as you all know, well, it's a set of transitions and a set of places. And then every transition has a multiset of outgoing places. So this symbol means the multisets, it's a free commutative monoid on S, the set of places. So to every transition, there's assigned a multiset of places. And that's the outgoing, and there's also an incoming. So this is outgoing and this is incoming. Well, maybe not S and T, but the incoming is also a multiset. So that could also be repetitions here. That's the classical definition, which is maybe first formalized by Meseguer and Montanari. However, the picture, which is how you usually think of Petrinets, is not completely faithful, because when you talk about multisets, it's really a set with a multiplicity. So that means, for example, that this set appears with multiplicity 2 in the what is it called, precondition of this transition, because so this should really, if you really want to make a faithful picture of this definition, you should rather put a multiplicity 2 here and a multiplicity 2 here. So you find that in the literature, but I mean, mostly people actually draw 2 edges. So the fact that there are numbers here means that it's not completely internal to the category of sets. All the other structures I talked about, there are configurations of sets, and the maps are compatible maps, and you can compute colimits and many limits pointwise, and there's a lot of very nice geometry taking place because they're just configurations of sets. This is not just a configuration of sets because there are numbers involved. And this is where the symmetries are lost. So the fact that you just have a 2 here, instead of actually having a real set that you could swap, that's what destroys everything. So I thought, okay, we should just take the picture seriously. So what do we see in the picture? Well, we see a set of transitions and we see a set of places. And now, because I already worked with all the other things, I put the places like this. Then we have the incidences between the places, transitions and places. There's some incidences. So that incidence is nothing more than a span. And this is actually, so this is the set of outgoing arcs, outgoing counting with respect to transitions. And similarly, there's an incidence between expressed by the incoming edges to the transitions. So that's another span here. But now they're no longer just multi-valued functions because we're actually landing in multisets. So that means that there is no condition of injectivity on these. However, altogether it should be, no, sorry, there are no conditions, no conditions. I was going to say a condition that says that these 2 spans should actually be relations. Now that's a very nice condition to put. If you do that, you get directed hypergraphs, and that plays a role in many, well, it's a feature. But for just what we see in the pictures, there are absolutely no conditions. So this is a Petrinet. and I call it whole grain Petrinet. So the whole grain is supposed to mean that you have not thrown anything nutritious away, like symmetries of the arcs. So I considered many different names like full-blooded or other things. And I also called them citus. And then I thought I should just call them citus Petrinet. But then I Googled citus just to make sure it doesn't mean anything unwanted. And it turns out that it's Greek for wheat. So then there was no doubt that it should be called whole grain Petrinets. So whole grain Petrinets. Okay, so now we have the definition as we would like to have it according to the experience from operats and properats and props and trees and graphs. Now we should just try to develop the theory of Petrinets in this new formalism. So develop Petrinet theory in the whole grain formalism. Well, Petrinet theory, that's that's a mouthful, because I think somebody made a bibliography with like 10,000 references on Petrinets. So of course, maybe you don't want to develop all that. What I mean by this is the process semantics or operational. In fact, the operational semantics is what it's often called. It fits precisely with what I'm doing, because the operations are the transitions. And what I argued on the previous blackboards was that you should design your Petrinets around the transitions. And then they have, I should also say now, what is a nice class of morphisms to look at for Petrinets. So if this is one Petrinet and here's another one, a morphism should send places to places. So these two maps are the same. It should send transition to transitions, and then it should respect all the incidences, and it should respect the interface of every transition. That means that a transition has to map to another transition that has the same outputs and the same inputs, or preconditions and postconditions. So again, it just means precisely that these should be pullbacks. And it means that you can get very far just looking at the Ital maps of Petrinets. There are more interesting maps to consider that you find in the literature. You can fiddle a little bit with those classes of maps, and sometimes it means that some of these maps should not be set maps, but they should be partial maps, or they should be spans, or they should be multivalues. There are different classes of maps, but they all look quite nice in the citus diagram formalism. Okay, so what is a process? Well, before I say what a process is, maybe I should just make a small well, I think I have the tendency of always using similar examples, because then I feel at home. So this transition T, okay, so a state of a Petrinet is a configuration of elements in the set of places. So they're called tokens, and it's also called a marking. So you can have, this is an example of a marking. A marking expresses the resources necessary for a transition to fire. Fire means that it consumes a token in each of the preconditions. So in this case, there are two preconditions here and here. There are tokens enough, so we can eat these two tokens and put it over here. So that would be a firing. So if you look what a firing is, it's a map from a graph. So here I draw a small graph like this. Sorry, I should also put one token back here. And this should have been in color, sorry. So this, let's make this blue. Then this is blue and this is blue, because one of the token coming in comes from the blue and one of the tokens going out is blue also. This should also have a different color, so that's a yellow coming in. And let's see if I have any more colors. They should also have a color. So what you see is that, oops, that should not be blue. What this really is it's an Ital map from this small graph to the whole CITOS thing. So graphs sit inside the category of Petrinets and Ital maps, because graphs are just Petrinets where these are monos. So it makes sense to take an elementary graph and map it into a Petrinet.
I cannot see anything.
Sorry?
Joachim, we have problem with your camera.
Up. Connecting. Uh-oh. Let me just try something here. I don't know what happened. Still connecting. So we take a 2 minutes break while I restart the driver.
Yeah, no problem. We can take a bit of a break.
Or you can ask questions.
Joachim, I love your term "coal grain" for dropping the conditions on something.
Thank you. I was happy when I found this Greek word. That was really what made the
yes, but more generally, if we have something that has some conditions on it that may feel unnatural, removing the conditions, we could call it whole grain.
So now I stopped the daemon. Now I just have to start it. So we're halfway, I think. Can you see anything now?
No, not yet. Okay. No, yes, we can see it. We can see you.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. It has happened for me before, and I have no idea what it is, but I know how to fix it.
No problem.
Okay, let's hope that it's. Let me just look at the time. I started a little bit late, didn't I?
Yeah.
Is it okay if I go 10 minutes more, or is it too long?
I think it's okay. Yeah, no problem.
So where were I? I was saying that a firing is precisely to map an elementary graph into the CITOS diagram of the Petrinet. And here we see exactly how the colors are encoded by these maps. So if you think of this one as the elementary graph and this one as the Petrinet, I'm talking about firings off. Now, a process is a configuration of firings that respects the flow of tokens. So what it is, in the end, it's an Ital map. It's a process of a Petrinet P. It's an Ital map from any graph to P. And then the graph has its own covering of elementary graphs, and they are all the firings that you see in the process. And the way they are connected up in the graph by colimits are precisely the causal relationships between the firings and the process, and where all the things about concurrency, whoops, something happened? No, it's okay. All the stuff about concurrency having to do with how firings relate causally is seen encoded in the graph. So this is very closely to what Goltz and Reisig did in the 80s, except that they worked with posets instead of graphs. And that means that they don't have good colimits. Well, that many drawbacks of their theory, but it's really very close to this. So I don't want to say I fixed the definition, because this was quite groundbreaking, but I think this contains precisely the information that was missing in Goltz and Reichig. Okay, so what's the algebraic semantics? So this is like geometric semantics. The algebraic semantics is just the fact that a Petrinet defines a bicollection. And what is, so there's a functor from Petrinet to pre-sheaves on elementary graphs. It takes a Petrinet and then it just takes the restricted home functor. So that means that it's the functor that takes an elementary graphs and sends it to the set of Ital Maps from that elementary graphs into P. So it's a restricted home functor. So it's basically a kind of Unida embedding. In particular, it's not difficult to show that it's fully faithful. You can also characterize the image. The pre-sheaves on elementary graphs, meaning the bicollections that arise from this embedding, are precisely the flat bicollections. And flat, that's a notion that comes from the theory of species in combinatorics. It's also called sigma cofibrant in opera theory. So that gives you a very nice embedding of this category of Petrinets into a pre-sheaf category where you can do all kinds of colimit stuff. Okay, so a Petrinet defines a pre-sheaf. So therefore it has a free prop. So that's the free prop. So a prop is in particular a symmetric monoidal category. And you can also call it the free symmetric monoidal category on P. But there are some subtleties that I need to fix before it's completely true. And those subtleties have to do with symmetries. So when we talk about pre-sheaves, we should really upgrade to groupoid valued pre-sheaves. So from now on, when we talk about pre-sheaves on elementary graphs, it's functors from elementary graphs up to groupoids. So it doesn't make so much difference for the definitions, but it does make a difference to fix this correspondence. Okay, so how does the correspondence go? So I will state it and say a few words and then I finish. So when you have these open-ended graphs, then you should begin to think of it as a kind of cobordism category, where you think of the graph as a cobordism, and you think of its boundary as its in and out boundary, so to form a category. Now, you can form a category, but it's not so interesting because when we talk about processes or when we talk about states of a Petrinet, we're not really interested in the individual elements of the, of the tokens in the marking. We just want to know that it's equivalent. So in other words, if I have one marking, so M is just a set. So a marking is an Ital map from this into this. And when I write this, I mean putting it as a set of edges. And here I have my citus, and this is Ital. So that just means that it's a set mapping to the places. So that's a marking. And of course, you are not so interested in the markings themselves, but rather the groupoid of all markings. So that's a groupoid. So that's the groupoid of markings. You also have the groupoid of processes. So that's a groupoid that looks like this. These two maps are Ital, and we don't care so much about the names of the elements in the graph, more about the whole groupoid of all possible. So if we have one graph decorated by P, so that's a process, you could compose it with another process like this, simply matching these up. So matching up, what does it mean? Well, you could ask that they should agree exactly, but that's a little bit artificial because we don't care about the markings except for the groupoid of markings. So instead of making it match up on the nose, we just allow them to have isomorphic boundaries. So that means that inside, if this is G and this is G prime, well, it's not the same as this G prime, it's another G prime. So we have the out boundary of G, and we have the in boundary of G prime, and we just ask for a bijection here. Then we can glue. So that means that if we just call this M, you can check that this push out exists in the comma category here, and that's, well, we just call it like this. Now, if you want to match these up, then you should have, well, let's put X1 is this one. It's the graphs decorated by P. It's the processes. Then there's a map. X0 should be this one. It's the groupoid of markings. So this is in. And there's another one which is out. And what we want is that these match, but they should only match up to isomorphism. So what we really want here is the homotopy pullback over X0. So this is a homotopy pullback. That means precisely that it's given by a graph here, such that the in boundary of the one matches the out of the second, but with a specified isomorphism. So there's a two cell sitting here, meaning that there's a natural isomorphism between these two functors. Now, this is precisely what appears in the Siegel condition. So there's a simplicial groupoid. So it takes n to xn defined by P graphs with, well, then you need some way of slicing it. So here you have something sliced into three parts: first part, second part, and third part. This is a colimit decomposition of the graph into three parts, and they're colimits over elementary graphs. Slicing, what is it called? Layering. Layerings are defined by Morse functions if you want to continue the cobordism analogy. So an n layering is a graph decorated by P with a layering like this. So that in particular, the two layerings are precisely these. So altogether, this is a Siegel groupoid. So Siegel groupoid is just the one level up notion of category, where associativity and composition and so on only works up to homotopy. And the theorem that fixes the correspondence that I just write is that this simplicial groupoid is the free prop, and I should say prop in groupoids on P. So this is the geometric semantics, and this is the algebraic semantics, and now they match up. And let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Joachim. That was for such a great talk.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions or comments for Joachim?
Well, I have two questions, Joachim. The first is how to make in your definition of Petrinets stochastic Petrinets.
That's a good question. So I don't know anything about this, but John Bias told me that some people, Evan Patterson and, oh, I'm sorry, I forget the names of his collaborators, but Evan Patterson, I think, is the main. So he's implementing a lot of applied category theory in Julia and CatLab. And they wanted stochastic Petrinets or Petrinet with rates. And it turned out that it was good for them to use this definition of Petrinet to implement it, because it's all represented by finite sets, and you can really get your hands on and make very easy colimit calculations. So they had some kind of stochastic version of this, but I confess that I have not had time to look into it yet, but it exists. And I think if you Google Patterson and Petrinets, I'm sure you will find it.
Yeah, thank you. And another question is in your article, Elements of Petrinets and Processes, you mentioned that Petrinets is like a multi-version of Weavers. I know you are interested in cluster algebras, so that you could do something.
Yes, so it's just the fact that, so if you take a quiver, now I should shift the camera again. That's correct. Every edge has, yes, every edge has two vertices. Now, what you should do, because I mean, you would like to have maps of quivers be like this. So what you should do to get a full embedding into here, well, you should notice also that this is actually self-dual. And this is important in some works on Petrinets, that there were no conditions. So I could put it like this, and it would still be a Petrinet. That's the dual Petrinet. I just interchange places and transitions. But the morphisms are very different. Okay, so if I want to take a quiver or just a closed directed graph and embed it into here, I should do it like this. I should put V as the places, E as the edges, and then I should repeat E here. So this should be the Petrinet corresponding to a quiver, and that's a full embedding. Well, I don't know if that answers your question now.
But do you know this, in a quiver you can make this the mutation and you can associate a cluster algebra, and it has some interesting structure. I don't know if
I have seen talks about that, and it looks absolutely fascinating. But I have not thought about it in connection with Petrinets. It sounds like it could be fun if you could mutate Petrinets. That sounds like really real fun.
Yeah,
that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Joachim? Well, it seems that there are no more questions. Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful formalism and a really beautiful idea that you can actually access your the edges onto transitions, and actually very useful, I think. And if you consider things not up to just the object part of your groupoid structure, you can also actually access your tokens, which might be quite useful as well. But yeah, maybe I missed this, but what is the exact relation between the usual notion of Petrinet and whole grain Petrinets? Is there like an equivalence of categories or some sort of
I mean, you can see, of course, the classical notion as a quotient of this notion.
Yeah.
But when you quotient it, you destroy the fully faithful embedding into elementary graphs. I think that's maybe the main point.
Okay. Okay. Well, is there a way of opening whole grain Petrinets? Does the open theory work well?
I suppose so, but I never tried it. I have to confess that I don't fully understand the open formalism, because I mean, from my viewpoint, it's nice that you can put things together with colimits. I don't yet understand the benefit of forcing these colimits to be like
one direction
and composing like arrow with one in boundary and one out boundary. I mean, this looks natural to me, that because there is an inherent flow in a graph, so it has a cobordism feel to it, and it's nice to compose them. But what they do, they declare certain places of a Petrinet to be the in places and certain other ones to be the out places, and then they compose like that. But there's no like, well, I don't see a clear choice of which places should be in and which should be out. So in the end, I think the main point is that you can do colimits, and that you can do very easily in the Citos formalism, because those colimits are computed pointwise.
Yeah.
And you could, in that formalism, limit yourself to designating fixed subsets or multisets of places that you only allow colimits along those. You could do that, and maybe it's, I have not completely understood the benefit of that. But it's very nice what they do, and they have very nice theorems. But I have not really tried to use it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Well, just one final question. So do you think there's a way of, so suppose you add more structure on your sets or groupoids of states on a whole grain Petrinet? Do you think that would reflect? So I'm thinking more of like an involution or something like this.
Of what? Sorry?
So I'm thinking more like an involution.
An involution?
Yeah, some sort of operation in states, in the groupoid of states on a Petrinet.
And so an involution, what should it interchange, or?
I don't know, some sort of operation between. So I'm thinking more like you have some structure, some more structure than is set in functions between the set on your state.
So I think that sounds interesting. So if you go from directed graphs, I should not. Maybe I should just stay at the blackboard. So all this is about directed graphs. There's a direction on every edge given by the distinction between in and out. Now, you could try to do the same with non-directed graphs. I mean, ordinary graphs or Feynman graphs, where you still have vertices and open-ended edges, and you still have Ital maps, but you have no direction anymore. So how this looks is that you have a set of vertices, a set of edges, then you have a set of half edges that expresses the incidence between the edges and the vertices. But these edges should be thought of as edges with a flow, and there's an involution here, which is fixed point free, that interchanges this with this.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the boundary of such a graph is the complement of this map. That means that if you take the involution, you get to something that is not connected to anything. So that's the boundary. And here the involution is really crucial, because otherwise you have not control enough to get the correct gluings, and you get completely crazy things that has nothing to do like with connecting things. Yeah. So now you should, the colimits you should consider are those that take the positive with a negative always, like when you pair a vector space with a dual, or a positron with an electron, and things like that in Feynman graphs. So it's really important to have this involution as soon as you give up the direction.
Okay.
When you have a direction, the flow guarantees a certain boundedness.
Yeah.
And you can recover that by putting this involution. So in the theory of non-directed graphs or Feynman graphs, it's really crucial to have this involution. So you could imagine an undirected notion of Petrinets, where you give up the distinction between precondition and post-condition. It's just a condition. Yeah. And it will be more compact closed or self-dual stuff. And I imagine you could start from this notion of graph. This is due to myself and Joachim for Feynman graphs. Okay. I think that could be used for some exotic notion of undirected Petrinets, where the involution would really be the crucial. But at the classical Petrinet, I'm not sure where the involution would come in. Okay. No, that's actually very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're sort of trying to model, the sort of compositional models for quantum field theory, in terms of, well, some sort of notion of a Petrinet. And okay, that sounds very interesting. Yeah. So the structure coming out of these are like modular operats. Yeah. Okay. Which is quite nice for Feynman graphs. Yeah. But I think that would be that. Well, so the direction in Petrinets, the sort of this, the flow in the, so that's good in some cases, but this idea right now, that would be a little bit more helpful, I think. For modeling. Yeah, that's actually, thank you. That was very helpful. Yeah. So you mentioned your paper with Joachim, what is the reference for this? It's called Feynman graphs. And compact symmetric multi-categories. Okay. So we were not completely sure if they were really modular operats, so we called it something else, but it is essentially modular operats. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's all the questions that I have. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments for Joachim? Yeah, well, it seems that there aren't. Well, thank you very much, Joachim. It was a great talk. Well, thanks for listening and for the nice questions. It was great having you here. Yeah, hopefully, soon you'll be able to come to Oaxaca. Yeah, I hope it will eventually become a reality, that conference. I was looking forward to it so much. Yeah, it's actually a beautiful town, and the food is the best in Mexico, probably, or some of the best. So I was actually going to Oaxaca 3 years ago for the Operat conference, and I was supposed to go, but then suddenly I could not, unfortunately. But a lot of my friends went there and told fantastic things about Oaxaca and the food and everything. Oh, that's great. main square in the city center, and sounds like a fantastic place. So I hope to go there soon.
Yeah, hopefully.
When you come, tell me. Yeah, I live here in Oaxaca, so I can.
Okay, so I look forward to meet you in person.
Yeah. I think I will go to the conference also. Thanks.
Yeah, so there's an institute of UNAM, of the National University in Oaxaca, Math Institute.
Ah,
so,
okay.
Yeah, so this is where Carlos is working.
Ah, so UNAM is not just in Mexico City.
Ah, no, there's well, yeah, as far as I know, there's 4 campuses. So I'm actually not in Mexico City either. So me and Robert Ockel were in a city called Morelia.
Ah, Morelia, yes.
Yeah.
I've never been in Mexico, but it's a name that is famous in mathematics.
Is it Morelia? Well, UNAM, yeah, I guess. But yeah, it's also a beautiful town. Yeah, food is also very nice. So you're also very welcome to Morelia anytime.
Oh, thank you. So maybe I should, if and when this conference takes place, maybe I should
yeah,
put
definitely
some extra time in.
Yeah, you can visit us too in Morelia. It's pretty close. And yeah, there's also the institute, the main institute in Mexico City, and there's also another one in another city, smaller one called Querétaro. It's also quite nice. Yeah.
Yes.
And
so I was examiner for a master thesis in Mexico.
Oh, really?
For Holger Meusen.
Oh, okay.
He's a student of Omar Antolin.
Omar Antolin, yeah. Well, he's a co-organizer for the seminar, but he wasn't able to come today, sadly.
No worry.
But yeah, okay. So he's at the Mexico City Institute. Yeah. So we're sort of joining the 3 institutes in one seminar.